possessing a bachelor's in the study of war and conflict. His climate activism spans international, corporate, and local grassroots levels, where he advocates for holistic understanding and response to the impacts of climate change on nature and human societies. William has attended the United Nations climate conferences, COP28 in the UAE, that was 2023, COP29 in 2024, and then he just went to the Global Sustainable Island Summit in St. Kitts and Nevis in 2025 with Kim Smith, right? You in as well. So he has a wealth of information and knowledge that he brings back and he shares with me too, so I can share to my students. So he's always happy to give his expertise. Completing his bachelor's degree and returned to Bermuda to focus his efforts on climate action in 2020. He has since been deeply engaged in a broad and diverse range of local development and environmental efforts and has been a proud 2-time summit host and 5-time climate justice track host for the annual Buoy Youth Climate Summit. So welcome, William. We're so happy to help you. Thank you.
For the sake of everything, where would you like me to stand?
Oh, probably there, yeah.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, right front and center. Oh, do you need to be able to click?
Yes.
Oh, then you're fine here. You can see everything. So hi, everybody.
Hello, everybody. And thank you for joining us today. And my apologies for my lateness again. So you can tell I've grown up here, and there you go. That's just how we are sometimes. But being is that we're in a little bit of a weird place these days in 2025, with a little bit of peculiarity. Almost anywhere we look at this stage, there is often a great deal of confusion or questioning in and around the causes and origins and reasons for a lot of the disruption that we might perceive or see today. And this has been a oncoming trend. Most generations seem to feel when they are surveyed that the world will end in their lifetime. And for some generations, as it turns out, throughout the course of human history in a broad sweep, for them and for their respective experience, that has been somewhat, and to lesser and greater degrees, the truth. And that's a strange narrative that has emerged in a patterning of human experience over time. And it's something that I myself have been very, very keen on understanding and coming to grips with, in that I have a deep, as Amy had mentioned, a deep passion for history and human experience. And I feel that it's something that adds a strange and often wonderful aspect of our perception, because ultimately what we are doing when we are looking at stories and when we are looking at history and human experience is we are telling stories about ourselves. And who doesn't like a story about themselves? Who doesn't like that, right? We all like to feel ourselves as part of something greater, whether it be a community, a tribal group, whether it be a kingdom, a state, a nation, a company, an association, or a religious affiliation. But all of these shared identities that we construct for ourselves to make sense of our social worlds are based upon the stories that we tell. And these come from oral histories, and they come from lived experiences that are passed down to us from those around us and from our parents and from those in our human communities. And over time, these patterns begin to play out in really, really interesting and unique ways, but also very similar ways too. And so there's a great conception as well that I'm happy to see more and more taken up, which is going against the grain that history repeats itself, because it doesn't exactly, but it does rhyme. And so there are broad songs that become familiar to us when we look back with enough information at the broad sweep of history, and that gives us much more power and focus for understanding our present day, and hopefully as well for the social world that we'll construct in the future. So just a little bit further, so Amy had very kindly given a great introduction as to some of the things that I've been engaged with. So I am a born and raised Bermudian. I grew up here. I shared most of the, I would hope at least, same experiences that many of you have had in Bermuda in enjoying our wonderful and pristine natural environment, in enjoying a relatively stable and prosperous existence, especially in the broad sweep of the human experience across not just today, but in the past and potentially still in the future. And that's something as well that calls upon us almost, not just to recognize and to be happy with and to enjoy in the present moment, but also to respect and to feel a sense of shared responsibility for passing on to one another. And so when we talk about, or when I like to talk about climate change, because not many people like to talk about climate change, so it is a little bit weird. And yeah, it is a weird thing for us to be here engaged with. I like to talk about some of the ways in which we can know. And in ways of knowing, what we can also look to are different tools for understanding climate pasts, for climate presents, and using those tools to extrapolate, therefore, what we might see in a climate future. So there's a lovely image there on the on your right that illustrates what is being called the shifting baseline syndrome, which explicates again that the present day experience that we see and perceive around us is not necessarily the way things have always been, nor will be in the future either. And so this is a great little image that we like to present because it demonstrates that we are already at a place, essentially, where we have sustained as a part of a terrestrial ecosystem on Earth, some degree of degradation. And that should give us pause, because the environment that we experience today is not the same that our parents themselves were experiencing, nor the same that our grandparents were experiencing, or previous generations besides them. And truly, the environment that we ourselves experience in this century, or that our children might experience, or if we're lucky enough for them, for grandchildren too, that they might experience. And so when we look to graphs like the one in the center just there, we see that in the broad sweep of what we would call settled human civilizational history, wherein human beings were beginning to coalesce from a hunter-gatherer mode of sustenance, of tribal arrangement, of organization, towards more settled societies in early towns and villages and cities, and the emerging forms of social stratification that began to develop alongside those. And we start to see in a broad sense that human experience as a very, very, very dense collective with all of this flourishing interactivity and sharing of knowledge and stories that has made the world that we know today possible. We see that we have done so in a very short time span. And if you look down towards the indexing line on the year just there, where we have the year 10,000 BC and the end of the last ice age, then we start to see what is being called and understood to be the Holocene, or a period in Earth's epochal history where we transitioned from an ice age state into a slightly warmer period. And over time, we have been able to enjoy what has been a very, very stable and secure and supportive Earth biosphere for our general purposes, emerging in settled agriculture, settled civilizations, trading relationships, the taming and domestication of other animals, the manipulation of landscapes and resources with tools like fire and stone tools and copper and bronze and iron, and all of the emergent tales that now become part of the collective legacy of our time on Earth. And what we're emerging into now, and what we see at the beginning of the use of fossil fuels, essentially as the primary driver of change in the past 2 centuries, and that's a short amount of time, is a massive, massive, unprecedented, human-driven change in a slowly changing Earth system. And that's an important distinction that we have to make, because there's often a lot of blowback, again, around climate narratives in saying that the Earth has always been changing. The climate's always changing, it's fine, we're gonna make it through. And that is true. The Earth system is always changing. And that's very important for us to recognize, because at some point, within those last 10,000 years, as many of you will probably already know and understand in this room, we did live on a very different planet, and it looked very different. And if you'd looked at a satellite image at that time, it would have looked very different to what we see today. And the Sahara Desert itself, as well as a key feature in North Africa, was much more akin to grassland, essentially, where there were massive, massive herds of wild animals living around and again, enjoying their place and time on Earth too, and all of the other associated gathering, migrating, pooping, again, which does actually become very important in history as well, because all of these things essentially play a role in the natural environment and the natural ecology of ecosystems that make our relationships with Earth possible and fruitful. And from those things, we start to get the emergence of human identity. We see this in cave paintings as well, as human beings have told stories and have shared with each other. And you can imagine back then, again, before we really wrote things down and told complex stories about the way things are, and what's happening on TikTok and who's dating who at this point in time. There was a time when a human being picked up another little human being and dipped that little human hand in a mixture of red ochre or some other plant-derived or animal-derived paint or pigment, and they put their handprint in that ochre and in that pigment and placed it on a wall. And it drew back because that was a human experience that was passed down from one to another that built a connection. And it exemplified that visual imagery and metaphor was possible in language forms that were not yet really well established throughout the human community spread across Earth. And these also began to manifest later on in more complex art forms, as you see on the right, as we began to paint and develop more imagery around the natural world that we inhabit. And these became other sources of storytelling. And indeed, a lot of these began to emerge with greater and greater social groups and greater social organization, oftentimes in really, really weird and wonderful ways that are still very relevant to us today. And that's what's so important about this, because a lot of these cave paintings we're now beginning to discover, in fact, weren't just art and painting the most pristine buffalo because it does look really nice, but also to tell stories about how these animals moved, how they migrated with seasons, where they went to, when was the right time to hunt and to kill members of a herd, so that you didn't necessarily harm the herd's chance of reproducing in the next season, so that you could sustainably live with what became an animal resource that we enjoyed at the time. And that became very important because those stories as well underpinned a human coexistence for a long time with the ecosystem, wherein human impact was relatively minuscule in the grand scheme of things and could be successfully absorbed by the Earth system. And when we take it forward with a better social organization point, then we see that our coalescence around material resources, so food, water, shelter, these very innate and powerful things that make human societies such as we enjoy it possible, these began also to become very core constraints and concerns. And if we look to the little image there on the bottom right, what these are examples of stone circles in the middle of the desert in Saudi Arabia. And it's a strange thing because these stone circles were established back as far as we know in 9000 BC, so just after that last ice age, and they were being built actively while the Sahara there was still green. And that becomes something very interesting because what we understand about these stone circles now is that oftentimes these were constructed as pens, and they were used for us to drive animals like those buffalo and other large herding beasts into these stone circles so that we could have a captive food source, and so that we could build an early refrigerator, and so that we could then understand that we had food security taken care of, and our material need, at least in that respect, was satisfied. And that gave us more time to express ourselves and to sit down around the campfire for longer and to tell more stories and to create more complex art and maybe to tell each other a couple other jokes and funny things along the way. But a lot of this also becomes lost in the broad scheme of material history because a lot of it is dependent also on the ways that we know things and the evidence that we can extract from history and from science and from data. And these become relevant for us more and more later on because the closer we get to the present day in history, the more these stories begin to be familiar to us and they begin to sound more like the stories that we tell each other. So I want to ask in the room here, how many of us are familiar with early biblical stories such as that of Noah and the flood? It's one that we know of, right? A man and his family are warned by God that there is going to be a flood and that he is going to wipe the slate of the earth clean and that all of the sinners and the wretched of the earth will be purged and he and his progeny alone will inherit it. But they have to take animals, 2 of each kind, on board a boat, and they have to survive for 40 days and 40 nights while rain is pouring and the earth is flooding and everyone else is drowning, essentially. And then when the waters recede, go back and go forth and multiply and repopulate. What we understand about this important story now in today's world with better ways of knowing and scientific evidence and carbon dating too, which becomes significant, is that this is a common story shared across almost every corner of the globe. There are indigenous groups out in Canada that have flood stories and flood myths, oral traditions that haven't been written down, but that are passed down as a story and told between one another for thousands of years. One similar in ancient China, in Australia, in Southern Africa. This was not just a story that occurred to Noah in the greater scheme of what we understand the biblical world in the context of that to be in the wider Middle East. What we see is a constant and a shared human experience of an ecological change, of flooding, of rainfall, of something that had an extreme impact upon us on almost every corner of the globe from what we can see and what we can know. And that becomes very, very significant too, because later on we found this thing on the left. And it might look like a piece of junk or a funky stone or anything there, but that is in fact an early document, and it's a book. It's a piece of writing. It's a clay tablet that at one point a scribe in the ancient civilization of Sumer impressed upon with a reed stylus to imprint letters and language and alphabet. And he told a story then of a man who had to evacuate from the lower reaches of the Euphrates and Tigris River, where it fed into the Red Sea, on board his houseboat with his family and two of each of the pack and herd animals of the household that were necessary for them to go upriver and find better land and then to resettle and repopulate. And it sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's kind of like, heard that one before, right? But, it rhymes and it's history and it's interesting. And we find other ones later on, like this other one down here. I'm not getting water from my sesame field. The sesame will die. Don't tell me later. Do not write to me. The sesame is visibly dying. Ibi Elaborat saw it. The sesame will die, and I have warned you. A man or woman writing out and asking for assistance in food, saying again that my crops are dying, and I am at risk of famine or starvation, and impressing upon others the need for cooperation and for assistance, and doing so in a way that calls people to communicate around a shared need. And so we get forward again a little bit further on from these documents in the 3rd and 4th millennium BC. And we come forward as well to a point in and around 1300 BC or so, where human civilizations across the globe were really beginning to get large and establish major metropolitan and urban centers. And we had the emergence of ziggurats, and pyramids were well established by that point. In fact, many of them by this point, at 3,300 BC, were already 2,000 or 3,000 years old at that point. The entire time period from when we would think back and look to the time of Jesus Christ in this day and age. Pyramids had been standing in Egypt. Ziggurats, great temples, had been standing in Iraq. And no doubt there were tons, thousands, millions of other stories that were lost along the way for us too. But when we come forward to this point in time, we see that there are other traces of climate change and environmental impacts on human society and history that are beginning to be understood and felt more. And this map refers to a period of time that we call the Bronze Age collapse. And it's something that is being understood more and more as a great segmentation and a great recession in the development and the complexity of human civilization at that time. And more as we examine environmental and archaeological evidence in and around this time period, the more the fingers and the footprints and the handprints of climate change and environments are making themselves felt. And what we see as well with the migration of other tribes from Europe, from Sardinia, from southern Italy, from France, from other areas, are peoples fleeing from areas that they felt they could no longer safely inhabit in great droves. We saw in the Bronze Age collapse, which extinguished the great pre-classical Greek civilizations of Mycenae, of the Hittite Empire in what is now Turkey, in Assyria, in what is now Syria, essentially, and almost extinguished the new kingdom of Egypt. We see an example of a great, almost cataclysm that enveloped a number of nations and a number of people and forced people to leave their homeland. And this starts to get a little bit familiar and hit a little closer to home too. because these become very relevant for our human understanding and our empathy with the people that must have lived through these times. And when we see also that the stories that were left in other writings and other clay tablets like these in destroyed cities and the paintings that we see in New Kingdom Egypt after this event, we see in fact that the Bronze Age collapse itself is an example potentially of climate collapse and the undermining of the innate material and environmental conditions that allowed people in certain areas to survive in such a way. And the stories that Ramses III at the time, the pharaoh, left didn't describe the sea peoples, as they were called, those roving marauders that sacked many of those great empires. They didn't describe them as just bands of pirates and warriors emerging from out of nowhere to go sack cities, although they did. But they mentioned them as groups of people, as tribes, such as the Shardana, who we now understand to be from Sardinia, from others from southern Italy. We understand now that they weren't just a group of guys running around with bronze swords, but they were bringing their wives and their children with them, their families. They were coming in search of a new and more hospitable land. And many of them, in fact, settled in what is now called the Levant in Palestine and southern Lebanon. And the genetic roots, another way of knowing now, the DNA roots that we can look at now as an understanding, an aspect of history, begin to tell a story that many of these people that settled in those areas too had ancestry from Spain and southern France and Italy. And they had migrated at this time to these areas and settled down in areas which were formerly inhabited by the people that lived there. And it gets a little weird too, because we also start to see in other parts of the globe, in the Americas as well, where in the Amazon, we begin to find traces now through soil analysis of a great complex understanding of a better and more integrated and potentially more sustainable relationship with nature. We understand also now today that the Amazon rainforest itself is less biodiverse in flora, in plant life, than we previously believed, and that many of the species that inhabit the Amazon today were probably, in fact, intentionally bred and supported and cultivated to support a sustainable existence of other humans in the region. It was early agroecology. And in areas like Bolivia and the Amazon as well, we start to see examples of what is called terra preta, or black earth. Very, very, very high nutrient-dense soils that have been built up over generations of practices, composting, and an understanding that this underpinned a great deal of the material conditions that made human society possible and sustainable then. And later on, of course, we get into, I've just thrown in this last little one here on the right, and it might be a little dated for some of the college students here in this, but Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat was a musical around another biblical story from in and around potentially the same period of the Bronze Age collapse and of the early development of the Amazon in Bolivia, because that told a story essentially of a man who was given a prophetic vision about an oncoming famine that would soon hit. And because Joseph at the time, the hero of the story, was imprisoned and essentially a dream interpreter to the Pharaoh, he was able to advise the Pharaoh, based on the Pharaoh's dreams of an oncoming famine, to start rationing and to start putting grain away and to prepare for lean years and to look ahead into the future and say, I need to conserve more of what I have in the present day because in the future I will not have as much. And these become more relevant for us today as we look towards the 21st century in greater detail. And we cycle a little bit further forward, and I'm going to jump a little bit towards now the medieval period and a time at which human civilization was really, really, really getting much more weird and complex, and stories were emerging, because we start to see all across the globe fingerprints of growing human impacts and the great snowballing impacts of those down the line. And in a period called the medieval warm period as well, we see a change across the earth as well in some places that made other great upheavals and changes possible. And we see as well that the medieval warm period ushered in a great warming, especially in Eurasia, up and above at the same time as the Islamic Golden Age was going on, that allowed grasslands in Mongolia and the northern steppes of Kazakhstan to really flourish. And because of that, The groups of people, the tribes that subsisted on those grasslands because they lived and worked with the herds of horses and sheep and goats that they lived with, were able to expand in population dramatically. What we understand later on from that is that something that we call the Mongol invasions, when great tribes of horsemen swept out of Eurasia and laid waste to settled civilizations all the way from southern China straight through to Poland and almost into Egypt. This was possible because of the population expansion that was made possible by a gradual environmental change. Subsequent to that, we now have an understanding that those Mongol invasions led by Genghis Khan probably extinguished up to 2 to 5% of the world's human population at the time. An extraordinary impact for one group of people, let alone one man leading so many others and his sons and grandsons in conquest. What we also see from this charted impact is that carbon, as an essential biomarker of human activity, when we cut down a tree, when we burn something, when we till the soils and release the carbon that's trapped there, many of you know the mechanisms by which carbon is released. These become indicators still of human impacts on the earth and carbon footprints as we now know them. So when Genghis Khan swept through and he extinguished up to 5% of the human population, what we saw was a resultant climate change. And we saw this because of a reduction in human activity, because he had simply destroyed so many people on his way. And we saw then forest grow back in Central Asia, and we saw greater carbon sequestration from those areas, and we saw a reduction that probably cascaded onto what was later perceived as a cooling and felt in myriad ways across the world. And this becomes important too, because when we see the growth of human activity, of human populations, and the growth of carbon inputs into the atmosphere, then we can also see that there is great potential for much more catastrophic impacts. And we cycle forward to a point in which a little funky dude from across the world in a backwater called Europe decided that he wanted to go find a better route to better goods, to spices from the far-off land of India, where the great Silk Roads had been cut off from them by the Ottoman Empire that was putting a tax on trade moving through them. And in the process of looking for these material resources, he stumbled all the way over to the Western Hemisphere, and you know what happened. We began to, unfortunately, often in many cases unwittingly, but in many cases and many more potentially as well, absolutely knowingly change the environment to our will and eviscerate the populations and the environments that had existed before them. And the Columbian Exchange, as it's now called, is perhaps one of the greatest examples of human bioengineering and change that has ever been unleashed on the earth. And it introduces, you see here, a great exchange of species of plants and animals that had never come into contact with one another. And it unleashed as well pathogens and germs that had never been seen or experienced before. And what we saw in the years subsequent to the Columbian Exchange was the spread of new disease, especially in the human populations across the Americas, of smallpox and whooping cough and malaria and yellow fever. And what we can speculate upon now, based on estimations of how much human activity was occurring at the time, was that we lost perhaps 90 to 98% of the indigenous populations that were living in the Americas in a very short span of time, probably within 100 to 200 years at the most. And this great reduction in the aggregate human population in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century had extraordinary impact. Because again, as Genghis Khan had demonstrated mere centuries before, that reduction in human activity had a carbon footprint too. And Europe began to experience then, after what was called and experienced then the Little Ice Age, when there was a dramatic cooling and less carbon in the atmosphere from the Great Recession and previous population, had led to a cooling that had some unintended consequences there. And so we start to see that our footprints and our impacts on the earth are much more pronounced, and they echo and ripple far more than we can immediately perceive. And that's why a long view of history is an important value add to our conversations in the present day. when we see the growth as well of great companies like the Dutch East India Company and the British Raj and the British Empire too, when we got away from the divine right of kings and of the church as being the absolute core organizing principle of our human societies, based again upon the stories that we told, saying the king was the most divine, he is the one we need to look up to and serve, the church is the one we need to abide by the rules for, absolutely. When we began to shift the stories that we told ourselves and tell stories of collective human individual capital, and us aligning perhaps to make a venture investment in a ship that would go across to the new world and bring back fancy spices or slaves or other things that we would define as commodities at the time. We start to tell stories about how we as a smaller individual group can have a more outsized impact, and ultimately as well, to enjoy a little bit more of the environment, for a time at least, than we were previously able to afford. And so the great almost democratization among people of access to capital and access to commodity really has had some extraordinary consequence. And this brings us almost to the foundations of the early modern era and what really starts to get the ball rolling in terms of human history towards the present. Because we also get in and around the early stages of European colonialism across the world, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, beginning in Britain with the beginnings of mining of coal, all of these things essentially for commodity and for a new one that was not being exploited in a different way, where before the commodity that we call energy would have been derived from labor, from putting a harness over an ox to plow a field, or sailing down to another distant continent and kidnapping people to till a field and to harvest crops or to build things for you. We began then to utilize aspects of the natural world for that energy commodity. And that became very, very, very rapidly intensifying because it was easier and it was cheaper. And it did have unintended consequences too. And this image here on the left is one of the few that we have of some industrial cities inside of Europe in early photography, where the Industrial Revolution and coal was really beginning to get going. And we started to see much more pronounced human impacts from pollution and degradation of human health and degradation of human dignity as well to supply and to provide for the need to consume that these industries began to usher in. We also began to see the expansion further with the examples of the Dutch East India Company and the British Empire, the undermining of what had been great civilizational centers and focus points of many great worlds far beyond the primacy of what the Europeans at the time had believed themselves to be. In China, and as well in the previous slide as well, in India, these great massive civilizations, which for millennia had been great centers of their own, were undermined and ultimately commoditized in many ways to feed a growing appetite. And further to this, as capital, as that organization of ourselves around amassing wealth for ourselves in our individual groups, began to look for other markets to expand into, we started to really, really dig into nature and dig into other aspects of human civilization that we didn't see before. And so we see also later on the scramble for Africa as well, as other European nations begin to really, really get themselves organized as a collective to carve up aspects of the earth for their own benefit. And this gets a little weird too, because in the early modern era, we get a rapidly changing relationship with our notion of how to live with each other. And the politics of exploitation, which were inherent in human civilization across many bounds, but often restricted by your ability to exert control over another person, began to manifest themselves in ever more insidious and complex ways. And we began to have devastating globalized conflicts, such as the First and Second World War, which ultimately as well had great roots in the securitization of commodities and resources, and what empire would have its flag put in what corner of the globe, and what resources it might be able to extract from that area. And energy as well became important, much more so And energy underpinned much of the grand strategy behind the thinking of the European powers engaged in the Second World War, because oil, not fossil fuel, had by that point, in the last 50 years, emerged as a more efficient energy source and a better one than coal, and we could power other things with it. And so those then began to usher in a second energy revolution that we can now see taking place in and around the post-war, after the Second World War period, that we're now in history beginning to call the Great Acceleration. And it's, as you can see from the graphs that we understand here, again, it is a great acceleration of human activity almost across the board, with resultant carbon footprints, with detriments, with undercutting our ability to sustain ourselves. And we get to other graphics in and around overshoot theory, when we can deplete in a year the amount of resources that the Earth can regenerate in a year. And this gets very, very pertinent and very close too. And our modern struggles, again, that we see in our everyday lives are part of this wider story. And they rhyme, and they are part of the same, and they have an origin. And the more we begin to talk about these things and put them into context, and also realize with that the last 2 to 3 centuries of really pertinent exploitation have only been that, 2 to 3 centuries. Short amount of time in that broad scale of the human civilizational experience that we looked at earlier. We have a really rapid change on our hands. And that's something that we have to come to grips with. And we have to do it right now. We're doing it right now. But when we look to data and we look to new ways of knowing that are emerging, we can begin to quantify and to demonstrate in data where these problems have come from, who might be responsible for in chief ways. And we can start to look at the narratives and assess again where we have come from, where we are now, and ultimately to have a better idea as to where we want to go. I'm pretty sure we can all look at this and say there's something really wrong with this picture. And it won't surprise you at all, of course, because I'm sure most of you who are engaged in the subject material have seen that those most vulnerable as well to the resultant impacts and the devastation and degradation that human activity has unleashed is being shouldered as a burden by those who are least responsible for it. And there are ways in which we can look at this as well. There are other contributions and other graphics that we can also look at that demonstrate how wealth and inequality plays a role in this, and how these are part of the same story, and how all of these aspects of human activity still can say, all right, we have a problem that is really pressing on our hands. And never before in our human history, potentially, have we had such a bifurcation of wealth concentration in the hands of a few versus the shared experience and endured burden of the many. And that should give us pause. And we can look again at individual baselines. We can look at corporate baselines of contribution as well. We can look at sectoral baselines as well of what the demand across the world right now for carbon output into the atmosphere looks like. And that's really important because in these ways, those narratives as well also tell a story. And they also point us in the direction of the kind of story that we want to tell. And that hopefully as well, that story will be one of reduction of these great inequalities, of a restriction in that, of a mitigation of the amount of resource that we draw upon on the earth on a day-to-day and year-to-year basis. And we can begin hopefully to tell a better story and write a better history of our species and our interactions and our relationships with each other and with the earth that might be a little better for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren. And many of you as well, because you are in this room and because by dint of that you are engaged in this subject material, are worried. I know that. I am too. If you're not paying attention. And that's okay. And it's okay to be worried, and it's okay to be scared of it too, because that helps us to rationalize as well what needs to be a motivating factor. And we have a strange misunderstanding as well, that in some ways, by crying fire in a crowded room, we might dissuade us from coming together and coming back towards a collective action against it. And that when we tell people that the world is ending, it's not, it's changing, that everyone is going to down tools and give up, and we're all going to, just march quietly away and let nature change in the way it wants. And in fact, we see from human psychology and from testing across this, and another way of knowing that fear is in fact a very powerful motivator, and it draws people together and it coalesces their interest to say that no, we will not allow this to continue to be our reality, and we won't allow it to continue to dominate our future because we don't like it, we don't want it. And it gives us a much more powerful and prescient and tangible sense of hope, because it delivers upon us in the aftermath of that the ability to see how much better things can be, and how much more of a beautiful world we still have, and how much joy and experience and compassion and a wealth of human experience must be held onto and protected and respected and enjoyed and laughed about. And that's something that we have to do because it's us and it's our story, and it always has been. And it starts again with what we can hear in laughter echoing across caves in southern France where you were painting on your fingers. And when you would tell jokes that were so good that some scribe in ancient Babylonia would press that into a clay tablet. And although the meaning might be lost to us some millennia later, it was obviously funny enough for somebody to say, all right, I got to write that one down. And that's something that we have to cherish and hold on to, because it's us. It's the story of us. And we can't allow this to be the end of our story. No, we can't let that happen. But it also means we have to be honest about where we are in that place in the story. And perhaps as well, that can be an even more powerful motivating factor for us to say, we need to come together and tell a better one. And we're going to tell a better one because it's worth it. And it's worth protecting, and it's worth coming together for. And that's really, really, really important, because when it gets to the stage of, again, the dude there on the left and the fellow that we would perceive from the previous slide, putting his hands up and saying, don't hang me. I was just doing my job. I was just treading the company line. I was going where they told me. Already we've lost too much. And already we've let too much human experience go past us. And so we need to be conscious as well of the place we find ourselves in time, of the future we're looking towards, with the past as a reflection of what we want the future to be. Because if we get to that future there, we haven't done a good job of listening to the past. And that means we haven't done a good job of respecting and listening to each other. And we look at the immense scale of change that is being understood now, that we have unwittingly and knowingly allowed to take place. And we look again to stories and investigations of some of those who are chiefly responsible, and the understanding that many of those great accelerators, those drivers of energy use, of exploitation, of corruption, of imperialism, are one and the same, and have known this story, and have been telling themselves a different story, and have been telling themselves that we can get away with it for a few years longer. We just need to distract and delay and deny and keep these people looking at something else. We're going to hide for a few more years and ride out the profits for a little while longer yet. Where are we with this? We're not making, well, we're making some progress, I'll be honest. Yes, it doesn't look great. Yeah, it's getting a little more serious there. The red bars, I don't know how much deeper into the red we can get there. Maybe we'll go purple soon, who knows? But we can start to see as well the story that this is telling, and we can start to recognize the stories that they're telling. And we can look to what's possible and where we can go. And we can look ahead as well to projected impacts. And we can start to see that there's a lot more of a story emerging that can't be hidden and can't be put away and can't be not told, because it is being told. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this data. When I was in university in 2017, 2020, and it seems so long ago, what I would have done for data like this, for resources, when many of these understandings were just now really beginning to be dug into. When I wrote my dissertation in my war and conflict degree, reassessing what I believe to be a gross underestimate of what climate change was likely to wreak upon social destabilization and subsequent relocation of people in search of better places to live. What I would have done for the understanding that is now welling across the globe of that same story, for that chorus that we're now here in this room a part of, and many of us too who might be engaged with work or other things too, etc. I hope they might come back and share the conversation with us later on too, but they're aware. People are understanding. And they understand that there's a bigger story being told. It's just up to us again to fill in more detail and to help each other understand, and for each one of us to teach one of us, and to build upon these other great messages that have been carried across generations, because we can really start to tighten screws on people and start to make impact and really drive change when we understand what we're dealing with and what we can do and how and what matters to people. And when we can see again that those who, shoulder a great deal of responsibility for this are beginning to seriously worry about the story that they've allowed to be told and whether it might come around for a less than happy ending for them too. Then we start to build towards the case for collective change and a better way of living with each other. And that takes us here too, because we can understand now that there are great things that we can do, not just as individuals, but even more so as a collective species. And that one of the most important things that we can do as an individual is to be less of an individual and more of a community. And to think of each other before ourselves, or at least equal to ourselves, because we recognize that their needs are the same as ours, and that your needs are just as important as mine. And that if I have nothing, then it's a shame. But if I have something and you do not, it is incumbent upon me to give you at least an equal measure of what I have. And we start to look again at other ways of telling stories, and we hearken back again to examples like we had in the Amazon, where lessons had already been learned for many hundreds or thousands of years about a better way to live with one another. And we can start again to reimagine and replace ourselves in the context of this story, and to see that the solutions are all around us. And we start to tell stories that really matter and become personal to us in other ways because of our social organizations. And here in Bermuda, we have such a wealth of understanding and a wealth of stories about our extraordinary people that should make us smile and happy and be proud, and also to understand what a blessing it is that we are able to teach now a story of how for the first 100 years of settlement in this country, when we built our houses mostly with wood, we endured two great hurricanes in the early 1700s, which blew down most of the wooden structures across Bermuda, but for the stone ones. And we told a story from that, and we learned. And we began to build a lot more stone and put a lot more effort into our roofs as well. And many of those old buildings still stand today. And those are being recognized again as hurricanes expand and floodwaters rise, and people wonder where their fresh water is going to come from. We as well have something to give, and we have stories to tell, and we have lessons that should and can be shared, not just for our benefit, but for theirs as well. And we can start to see ourselves as part of something greater, not just as a responsibility to deliver, but also as our right as human beings, as part of Earth, as part of nature, to enjoy a safe and habitable biosphere. And I put the center one in there as well, just because we do talk a lot about carbon and carbon emissions in the climate space and the resultant impacts that it has on the greenhouse effect in accelerating a lot of the warming and changes too. But we also have to recognize in that it is one very important, but one part of the changes that we have brought upon the Earth. And that oftentimes, if we are looking not just at cutting carbon emissions and reducing the amount of fossil fuels that we're burning as the chief cause of this, And we are looking at transitioning away from very, very heavy, intensive animal agriculture, that there are other aspects and other tools that we can deploy that usher us towards a better story. That also integrates land use changes and how we look at farming and food systems. It integrates those energy systems with our home and our built environments and how to make those stronger and more resilient against the needs of the 21st century. When we start to look at socioeconomic mobility and our ability to shift from jobs and maintain a degree of material well-being, at least, that all of these things are part of that same story and very relevant, because all of these investments that we make in that shared future become returns that we enjoy in the present. It means also understanding and changing our perspective and mindset around those things that in the future are probably going to harm us more than they're worth right now, which is why I'm looking around and I'm happy to not see any plastic water bottles in this room too. So there's already progress being made, and that's fantastic. And there's so much more progress that needs to be made, because we understand as well, as many of you will likely have heard, that we've done the thing that in 2015, we pledged not to do. And that was to cross the 1.5 degrees C warming threshold established by the Paris Agreements, the point at which science had estimated that we would start to experience really, really, really bad effects from climate change. And we would unleash what are called tipping points. Earth system changes, permafrost melting that releases more carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, Antarctic sea ice dieback, which again increases the amount of dark water, which absorbs more heat. All of these things, Amazon dieback, and the potential now in this century of a collapse of the jet stream, which may lead, in fact, weirdly enough, to a great global cooling across the north of the Atlantic. What is really crucial here is not that the changes themselves are underway, but it's the pace of those changes. And that's what we're looking at right now, and the crucial lesson that we have to endure. That the pace of change is something we need to pull the brakes on. We need to slow down the rate of warming, slow down the rate of degradation across the earth, and curb our impulse again to consume beyond our means to regenerate. And what we look to then is a vision of how we might change the world for the better, despite the specter that hangs over us here. And that involves overshoot and return, and the deployment of those lessons for us in this century. It involves recognizing how the Earth system and the biosphere, through our ways of knowing, interacts with one another, and how we can sequester more carbon out of the atmosphere with stronger soil resilience, with more tree reforestation, with cutting energy use, indeed, which is akin to plugging a leak, because we're exhausting ourselves mopping the floor just now. We then look to all of these ways in which we can take action and how we can turn around this trajectory that we seem to be on. There are no immediate cause and fault and ill will of our own in this room, but to begin to tell a better story, but to begin to rewrite our history, to interact with each other a little better, to be kinder, to be more loving, to be more communal, to be less separate from one another, and to be less separate as well from the earth, and to think of ourselves less as an individual and less apart from the earth, but more as a part of a community and part of an ecosystem, and seeing ourselves as part of a web of life and joy and compassion and love that is the essence of habitable life on this earth. And that's extraordinary, because it gives us a lot of great courage and a lot of great cause and a lot of great ability, again, to build a much better world. And for all of us in here, that's possible, because we can, and we are already. And you're here, and maybe 2 to 3 to 5, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have been. And we wouldn't have been having this conversation, and we wouldn't have been telling these stories. And that's coalescence of action, and it's growing. And we know now from surveying that probably around anywhere from 89 to 92 people in the world globally support the cause of climate action. And that's an extraordinary statistic, because it tells us that people recognize that we are part of a story. We are hungry for a better story, and that we want to tell it, and that we are impressing upon our leaders and our community members and our parents and our children the need to take care of each other and to take care of the earth. That should give us a lot of faith and a lot of hope and a lot of courage. So yeah, it's a scary prospect, but it's something as well that calls us back to the innate root of ourselves. It calls us back to our existence as part of this living biosphere, not as kings or overlords of it, not as the people that were chosen to have dominion over nature, not as conquerors or redevelopers or any other manner that in some way says that the earth is not us, because we are earth and we come from the earth, and every part of us is made of the earth. And when we are passed as well, then every part of us will be taken back to the earth. And we know that because it's us, and we feel it. And we feel this fealty with every one of us in this room because it's us. And you are me, and I am you. And you are every other person on this earth, and every other animal and plant, and every little bit of bacteria and fungi too, in a strange sort of way. But there we go. It gives us pause, and it gives us a lot of room for a better conception of ourselves. And there's a lot more we can talk about here, and I'm not sure what we're doing on time as well. But I can also say that it's worth a conversation, because it's a story that we're going to be telling each other for the rest of our lives. And we're going to be continuously working on telling a better one, because that's our nature. And it's the nature of nature to be resilient and to adapt and to anticipate. And it gives us a much greater conception and ability to tell a better story about ourselves. So we'll leave it with this, but as well, I'm happy as well to go through any other kind of sources or any other background information or any other stories we want to tell each other, or even to get a little bit more specific in and around impact points for us as individuals here in Bermuda locally, for us as a Caribbean region, for us as a global population too, for what we can do in our homes and our jobs, for what we can do in our polities and our social clubs, in our organizations. There's a great world of solutions and life and activity that's happening right now. And I love this month, November, not just because it's my birth month, but also because at this time, this is when people from all around the globe are gathering and they're taking stock of what's happened in this last year. And these wonderful reports, such as we've just received, like the latest State of the Climate report, are coming out in anticipation of that next conference of parties to the United Nations Summit, those COP conferences that we sometimes hear about and complain about our leaders burning jet fuel to go to without necessarily bringing anything that we can immediately see in return. And it gives us stock for adding literature to that story. And it helps us fill in details. And it lets us pivot further and get closer to an organization around telling a better one. So I'm happy to share in this story with you all and to continue to do so, because you've all shared so much more than you know with me. And that's just in our nature. So thank you.
A very quick thank you to William for a very thought-provoking presentation, which I'm sure you'll take away with you. And remember that these are online if you want to go back and review many of those super slides with so much information on them that we can look at and examine those resources. So thank you, William. That was excellent. As I said, very, very thought-provoking. I know students have to get to class and other people have to make their appointments, but can you hang around if people want to talk to you individually? And again, those slides will be available on the YouTube. If you've got the old poster, you can find the link there for further references. But absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much, William.
I just wanted to note as well, and especially for students and anyone else as well who's just generally interested in this, I do keep track of all of the sources as well that these are drawn from. I didn't have time yet, my apologies, to format a full bibliography and works cited everything for the sake of this presentation, but I have kept it. And I'm very happy again to share because it's all part of that story and it's really coming together. So yeah, thank you guys and looking forward to hearing your stories.
Thank you very much.